when John told me he was coming for a few days here in Egypt to continue his different projects that he is always on top of, I wanted to really take advantage of his time and to have him share his thoughts with us on these issues. So let me stop with that introduction. John, you have the floor. When you finish commenting, I'll open the floor to anybody here in the room. Let me also just notify people, this session is being recorded, it's being broadcast, and it will be rebroadcast also. So it's a public session, not a closed one. John.
Nabil, thank you very much for having me. It is both an honor to be part of the Tahrir Dialogue. It is such a delight to not only see you, see so many friends, to be back in Egypt. I was talking to my wife earlier today. She said, it's been a really long time since you've been in Egypt. I said, it's only 3 years, or actually 2.5. And she said, for you, that's a really long time. So she knows how happy I am to be here. It is an honor to be also in Hill House. As I was telling you earlier, I spent many hours on the second floor emailing my wife when I was a student here 30 years ago, when you had to use the second floor computer lab. Emails would sometimes take 3 or 4 days to go back and forth, which gives you a sense of how much the world has changed since then. I think the United States is changing in a really interesting and important way. And I was telling a friend earlier today that I think this is a change akin to the change that the United States went through in the 1960s and 70s. I think this is a deep societal shift about what the establishment is and what it should be. I think there is a turning away from traditional modes of authority that is profound. Also, I think it's important, if we take that context, and I'm happy to talk about it more, but I think it's important to note how much of where we came out of the 1960s and 70s was not obvious at the beginning. I know what we looked like when we entered the late 1960s and the end of ties. People thought you'd never have ties again, right? With the long hair, with the women's rights, with the rise of gay rights, a whole number of things. And yet the 1970s ended with the Reagan Revolution. Not at all clear that that's where that was going to go. I don't know where this is going in the United States, but I can tell you this, that I think a lot of the enthusiasm for the Trump presidency throughout the country is from tens of millions of people who feel both neglected by elites on the coasts, but also disrespected by elites on the coast, that these people take care of themselves and don't care about me. And what they love about Donald Trump is Donald Trump agitates them, and that makes them feel powerful. There are parts of the Republican Party which look at where the Republican Party is now and just shakes their head. Liz Cheney, who is Republican aristocracy, looks like she's going to lose her seat in the House of Representatives because she can't win a Republican primary in Wyoming, which is incredible. The Republican Party is changing. The country is changing. This is, I think, a broader process. And again, I don't know where this is all going to stop, whether it's going to stop with there being some sort of serious split, whether it's going to stop with a sort of populist Democrats uniting with populist Republicans and pushing aside elites, where the elites are going to be able to reestablish control. To me, there's a broader set of debates going on in the country about who we are and who we should be and who should have power and under what rules. I think it will take years and years to work itself out. I don't think it's obvious how it will come out. I don't think that the current political divisions are necessarily going to sustain themselves. And I think where this all settles is going to take perhaps a decade to work itself out, and I don't know what the end point is going to be. I think part of this alienation is the post 9/11 era, a sense that we were fighting endless wars to try to fix the Middle East. And after more than a decade, the wars didn't end and the Middle East wasn't fixed. I'm sure you remember the Bush administration's efforts to introduce democracy into the Middle East. I remember you were involved with the dialogue at the Bibliotheca Alexandrina. I mean, there was a real sense that the US was going to fix the Middle East and Egypt was going to play a key role. I remember Obama's speech at Cairo University, right? I mean, there was this sense of possibility, and I think a lot of Americans look and say, what did we get for all that? What did we get for the soldiers we lost in Iraq and Afghanistan, the money we spent in Iraq and Afghanistan? We neither transformed the Middle East nor made ourselves better off, and we could use that money at home. There's a large part of the US military that's fed up with the Middle East, but I don't think that that's really what drives most Americans. I think there is this sense that we need to reform ourselves before we reform others, that we need to deal with our problems before we fix other people's problems. And if there are ways in which we should work with other people, we can find ways to work with other people. But the idea that we need to force our ideas on other people, I think strikes a lot of Americans as a quixotic enterprise. I think it's wrong to argue that that this is a reflection of neo-isolationism. I think that there is, though, a sense that you can't force reform. We should encourage reform. We should partner on reform. We should play a role helping other people accomplish what they want to accomplish. But this idea that the United States needs to invest in making other countries look more like us, I think there's a sense that there are opportunities. We should engage. We should be cautious of the fruits of authoritarian systems. But the idea that reform is central to our national security strategy, I think is a characteristic of the Bush 43 administration, which has sort of lost its salience. We currently are focused on great power competition, which has largely been interpreted in terms of China, but also has a Russia component. But I think for all that we talk about great power competition, we're not exactly sure what its parameters are. The great power competition idea is principally a military idea, and its most important proponents come to it from a military perspective. I think we've had a hard time wrapping our heads around the economic components, and certainly our difficulty passing trade deals and the Trans-Pacific Partnership is a sign of, I think, the deep ambivalence of a lot of Americans for trade, because of a sense that free trade has cost the United States jobs, certainly cost jobs in large parts of the country, rather than created jobs, has enriched people on the coasts and immiserated people in the middle of the country. But it seems to me that the other piece of great power competition is the issue of whether there are international standards by which the world operates, that you have this rules-based international order This, frankly, is an idea that elites love. Elites love talking about rules-based international order. I think for a lot of the country, that doesn't really make sense. And so what sells for great power competition for a lot of people who don't want to talk about international law is the possibility of war with either China or Russia. And then you have a question of, well, what are you going to fight about? And I think there's actually a debate about what we should be fighting about. Should we fight to defend Ukraine? A lot of Americans say absolutely not. Should we fight to defend NATO? I think that's tougher. Should we fight to defend Taiwan? I think there are differences on that issue. And I think that's going to be something that we're working through now in the Ukraine context, which could well touch on NATO. And certainly everybody in Asia is looking to see what the United States is going to do in Ukraine for what it will tell you about what the US will do vis-a-vis Taiwan. The Ukraine conflict is a reminder that the world hasn't changed as much as people wish the world had changed. There was, I think, after the Cold War, a sense almost that we had gotten over war, or getting over war, and certainly had gotten over the possibility of great power military engagement. And Ukraine's a reminder that we certainly are not beyond great power military engagement. There's a real possibility of an escalation, which I think the Biden administration is very conscious of. But I think we agree. I think this war has months to go. I think what Putin has done in Syria is an indicator of what he might do in the Ukraine, which is you don't have to occupy land with ground forces. You don't have to do what the US tried to do in Iraq with I don't know how many 100,000 troops and build up a government and all those things. Happy to bomb from the air, use artillery, make cities unlivable, and then see where things go. I don't think it has to be expensive. I don't think it has to be to create a perfect post-war system. I think it has to be to inflict pain and to inflict more pain on others than is inflicted on you. Now, I think Putin's been very surprised at the amount of international unity there's been on Ukraine. But I think where we are going is into a sustained conflict, and we're only a few weeks in. I think this is going to be a sustained conflict, and what the settlement looks like is going to be several steps away with very unclear outcomes and very unclear consequences for concepts of American leadership. Where it comes to the Middle East, I think the US still cares a lot about the Middle East in many, many ways. And I've spoken to all the senior folks who work on the Middle East. There is an insistence on not making the mistakes we've made before, not getting involved in the sorts of endless military adventures we've had, to not be the hired mercenaries to fight the wars of the region. But what I think is really in the Biden administration's mind is how can we find a way to make the United States a partner in creating a better future for the region, not to force it on people in the region, but to partner with good ideas, to partner with people who want partnership, not to wag our finger and teach lessons, but to try to create alliances of people with good ideas, to try to help the region deal with the energy transition, which is going to fundamentally reorganize the political economy of the Middle East over the next 30 years. It will. And the danger of the Middle East not getting the energy transition right is a profound danger both for the oil exporting countries of the region and for the labor exporting countries of the region. And there's a lot of interest, they call it B3W, Build Back Better World. Okay, you don't have to like the phrase. But they're thinking about how can they really play a constructive role in the things in the region that matter. I think that is going to be, what I've told them, frankly, is you need a positive agenda in the Middle East, because when you only talk about what you're not going to do anymore, when you're going to right-size your ambitions with your resources, what everybody hears is less, 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 and they have no idea what you actually care about. They have no idea what the priorities are. But I think there is an interest in finding a better relationship, and I think that relationship is an opportunity for the region. I think it's an opportunity for people in the region, and it's an opportunity to build a stronger foundation, not because the US is going to shape the region in its image, but because the United States can help play a role in the region's own necessity of dealing with a future which, quite frankly, is going to look a lot different in the next 30 years than it's looked for the last 30 years. And that may actually be a good thing, and I think it's in the US interest and the interest of leaders in the region to find ways to make the next 30 years better than the last 30 have been. Thank you.
Thank you, John. Thank you. You answered one question, which is basically America is mixed up and not yet determined what it wants to be, what it wants to do. And this will take a while to settle as a society. But that being said, if you're undecided, how can you play the role of a major power internationally when, frankly, friends and foes can't really determine what your reaction will be in terms of support in your friends or opposing your foes? The problem really is people abroad don't understand what American policy is or what it will be. And I allow myself to add to that, and I had this discussion with John Kerry many, many times when he was senator and then later as secretary, that American elite never explained foreign policy to Americans as being useful to America, but rather where's the threat here and where's the threat there. So you were actually lost when the Cold War ended because you couldn't determine where the threat was. And then it took you time to sort of really get lost in terms of how do you define why somebody in mid-America should be interested in what's happening in Asia or in the Middle East or Latin America. I'm concerned that you're too big to ignore, but at the same time, you're too disoriented to have as an effective role as in the past. The only thing I'd sort of challenge you on, and then as host, I will give the floor to everybody here. I just don't agree that anybody asked you to fight wars in the Middle East. These were your choices. We did not ask you to fight the wars in the Middle East. Actually, what we asked you to do, you didn't do. So we have our own mistakes and our own problems. But the idea that we asked you to enter Iraq, I just frankly can't share that. We wanted your support in liberating Kuwait, definitely. And I can go on and on. If you want to be the major power in the world, it's not only the muscle of your military power or your economic power, it's actually the strength of your moral commitment to right and wrong and law and order, which internationally you're not committed to. And I can tell you, in the case of Ukraine recently, first reaction here in Egypt at least was, well, Putin maybe legitimately have a good reason to push back a little bit because there's so much hypocrisy in the Western world. Then, when he used force, the tide turned against Putin. But it wasn't because people were more supportive of the West. Middle Easterners are very disappointed with the West, no matter which way you want to put it. They're also disappointed with Putin now. But the West, and America is on top of the West, really has a tremendous effort and challenge before it, because simply saying one thing one day and then changing the next day because of domestic pressures back home is not a solution if you want to be the major power. If you simply want to be another big power, that's a different ballgame.
So, you know, as a historian of modern Egypt, I can't remember a time after the Second World War when Egyptians were pro-American. I mean, I still remember when the U.S. was trying to help with Point 4. There was a book that came out, Al-Istimar al-Amriki al-Ghadid, right? That came out in Cairo. I mean, there has been, as far as I can't remember a time when Egyptians weren't suspicious of American power because the U.S. was too pro-Israel, because the U.S. was this, the U.S. was that. You know, we have this fun irony that Americans hate Jimmy Carter and love Anwar Sadat, and Egyptians love Jimmy Carter and hate Anwar Sadat. But that is what it is. You know, in terms of the Iraq War, my own view is that it was a direct consequence of 9/11 and was an answer in search of a question. That Paul Wolfowitz thought that we should have gone in 1991, and it was 9/11 that provided the question for which invading Iraq was the answer. And as you know, the common question was, once we go into Iraq, do we go right or left? Do you take down the regime in Iran, or do you take down the regime in Syria? That hasn't worked out very well. My concern with the Iraq War, I think I was as doubtful as you are that it was going to work out the same way. That's why I left the U.S. government when my fellowship was up in 2002. You know, in terms of can the U.S. lead if it doesn't know where it wants to go, I think that doesn't make the U.S. resolve the fundamental questions of what it's trying to lead toward. I think, you know, the President Trump, who's very popular in parts of the Middle East, said the biggest mistake the U.S. ever made was getting involved in the Middle East. We wasted $8 trillion in the Middle East. Started off at 7, then he bargained himself up to 8. But that's I think a genuine sentiment in a lot of the United States, that you can invest endless amounts of money in the Middle East, and you will neither improve the Middle East nor improve American security. So what are you actually trying to do? I think the Biden team is looking for different kinds of engagement which are real and will address the fundamental strategic issues in the region. I think there is a widespread acceptance, that the sort of counter-radicalization as an investment doesn't make sense, that the security issues in the region are largely the ones the U.S. can help with are international ones and not largely domestic ones. And we have to be thoughtful about where we invest. Now, can the U.S. make the region prosperous? No. But I think, you know, we come from a place, the American system is one that has always been suspicious of governmental capacity, which is strange, of governmental capacity. And the strange thing is that we keep talking to countries in the Middle East, you have to boost your governmental capacity, right? That's our message, constant. But the domestic conversation is all about how do you constrain government, because an unconstrained government is a problem. because you need checks and balances. You need a court system that constrains the legislature and the executive. You need a legislature that constrains the executive and an executive that pushes the legislature. And our whole system is about keeping anybody from getting too much power. And I think the concern in the Middle East, the US concern with the Middle East, is the sense that there's too much unconstrained power, and that's not going to serve the interests of the people, that the idea of benign autocrats is something that looks better in theory than it's often worked out in practice. But can the US fix that? I think the US can't fix it, and I think the US's commitment to forcing it in the Middle East is diminishing. There was an argument 20 years ago that the reason we have to support the Ikhwan is because the Ikhwan is going to demonstrate that you can solve these problems and put checks and balances, and you can demonstrate that it's through the ballot box and not through bin Laden, and we're going to fix all those things. That's not where the discussion is in the United States now. But the discussion is, are people really going to want to invest in countries that don't have resilient legal systems, where the military intelligence operations aren't major economic actors? That's not about us. That's about the interests of the region. And I think, you know, that the attitude has to be, we'll help you if you want help, but we can't force you to do things you don't want to do.
Again, I had a discussion recently with a U.S. administration official, and I asked him what the policy was in the Middle East. And his answer was, let's not make it worse. And I said, that's not a very clear policy, especially for a superpower, because that's where it is. We're just so tired of so many wars that the policy is don't make it worse. I must say it's difficult to swallow. But again, we have our problems. And my opinion is we have to solve our problems mostly on our own.
Yeah.
With friends, but mostly on our own. But as somebody who studied America for years or worked in America for years, my problem with your system, in as far as trying to pursue goals, is so short-term. You cannot achieve any of these goals of fixing systems on a 2-year or 4-year electoral system, because they take time. It's not about changing one law or the other. It's about changing a culture, and it doesn't have to end up being a culture like yours, by the way. It simply has to be a culture that works well for the locals. But you're not there yet. You want to, first of all, make it like yours, and to do it in your short term, that works with your system. And again, if you take the Bush years, the first 4 years of Bush were different from the second 4 years of Bush. He was very forceful in the first 4 years of Bush on Iraq and on reform. Second 4 years of Bush, he was so tired that he was all over the place on reform and announcing victory in Iraq, which still hasn't happened.
The first year of Bush was very different. There was a talk of humility, right? That we're going to fix America first. And then 9/11 happened. I think, you can't explain U.S. policy in the Middle East in the early 2000s without understanding how completely disorienting 9/11 was. Right, and what happened in 9/11? I mean, the people. I mean, we know them both. The people said. I mean, I think after 9/11 there was a systematic discrediting of Middle East experts, and people said, "You guys were supposed to be paying attention to the region. You didn't predict this was going to happen. You didn't keep it from happening. And now we, the people who had the creativity, ambition, and boldness of vision to win the Cold War, are going to win this war against extremism in the Middle East," and took the discrediting of impact of the war in Iraq to create a balance again. But we spent 10 years, I mean, I say this is a Middle East expert, we spent 10 years being marginalized because we hadn't predicted and prevented 9/11.
But just to confirm your point, when I was ambassador in Washington, I spent a long time, 9 years there. And the last 3 years, I did not even know who was the head of the Egypt desk. Not because ambassadors are too senior to deal with the head of the Egypt desk, but because they kept changing him every 6 months and bringing in one so-called terrorist expert after another, who had worked in Afghanistan or in Iraq and knew nothing about Egypt. So it confirms your point. You became fixated with anti-terrorism or dealing with 9/11, which as a major power, superpower, you have to deal with that, but you can't afford to be fixated with it because the system doesn't allow for you to be a one-issue nation. Anyway, I've gone on for too long. Let me open Ramzi, Ambassador Ramzi.
Thank you very much for the presentation. I think it explains and confirms the confusion you have in the United States that you've been having for some time, particularly when it comes to foreign policy, but also domestically. You've spoken about 9/11 as being a disorienting event, which I completely agree with you. My concern now is that Ukraine may be also a disorienting event, in the sense that there has been confusion. The U.S., like the rest of the world, has been in transition for some time. And during that transition, in terms of foreign policy, after 9/11, the priority was combating terrorism. And then slowly it became, during the Trump administration, big power rivalry. And what I see and what I fear now with Ukraine is that it's almost becoming a civilizational rivalry. Us against Eastern despots, us against autocracy and so forth, as certainly represented, in your view, by Putin, but of course also China. I think this will not end the confusion in the United States. I think it will add to it, and third world countries won't know exactly what the United States will ultimately end up in its policy vis-a-vis the third world. They will be caught between the West and the East, and the autocratic East, with which many identify with. So is Ukraine a defining moment? Is Ukraine will not end the confusion in which the United States has been experiencing, like many other countries, by the way, because the international system is going through a transition.
So thank you for that thoughtful question. I don't know where Ukraine goes. My sense is we are not close to the end of this conflict. I don't know that we can say now how it ends. I think there is a fundamental principle that large countries can't simply roll into smaller countries when they don't like their foreign policy orientation, which is really what happened here. And I think, I would imagine that most countries in the Middle East would feel a little bit relieved that it's not permissible for large countries to just roll into smaller countries. But maybe I'm wrong. But there is the prospect of great power warfare and not just great power competition. There is the real possibility that Putin will try to edge into NATO countries as a way to undermine NATO. There's a possibility that as this goes on longer, you'll have a political split in the United States that some people will, with Russian encouragement, I would argue, say, why are we involved? Why do we care about other countries around the world? We should care about ourselves. I'm tired of paying $4 or $5 a gallon for gas. I don't know how this plays out, but I do know, A, the enemy always gets a vote, and B, wars never end up the way you think they would when you started them, right? I mean, wars represent a big shaking up of the board, but where the pieces settle is often not at all what people anticipated when they started the war. I don't know if this war is going to end with Vladimir Putin in power. I don't know if this war is going to end with 1 million casualties. I don't know if the war is going to end with NATO strengthened or weakened. I mean, I can, suggest things, but I think there's a lot unclear. So will this be a defining moment? It might be. But I also don't know what the definitions will be that will result from it. But my sense is that this will be pivotal in some way. It will be pivotal in terms of the broader discussions going on in the United States, which I think will go on long after the dust settles from this conflict. Putin's clear goal is to undermine solidarity in Europe. I can't tell you if he'll be successful. But it seems to me that the world looks differently if he is than if he isn't. And that raises the stakes, and it also raises the possibility that this could be a very costly war for all sides. It's good to be back.
Good to have you here. And just to tell you that the podcasts are very well heard and very interesting. So thank you very much.
Ambassador Anise was a guest on one of my podcasts.
So thank you for that, and keep it up. I mean, it's very good. I want to stay on the same theme you just were discussing now. And you had mentioned that probably the Ukrainian conflict will develop into a longer-term conflict that may be with us for some time. And as a conflict in the central balance of power, it will definitely affect other parts of the world, including the Middle East. Now, if we look at American policy in the last few weeks, we're seeing a kind of a renewed interest in the Middle East, shall we say. I mean, people who said that, you know, the U.S. was pivoting away from the Middle East are saying, well, maybe they're taking another look. They want to come back. We're talking to regimes we didn't like very much. We're talking about the importance of, everybody was writing off the importance of Arab energy. Now it's coming back. Everybody's interested in this. Is this a moment of reassessment and reshaping a new Middle East policy for the U.S.? And if so, what would it look like? I have another question, Dean Fahmy. No, I just want your permission as to go ahead. See, I'm improving all the time. The second one is, given the importance or the probable importance of this conflict in the central balance of power, and based on what we know in terms of history, it means that both sides will start putting pressure on third countries to take sides. You're either with us or you're with them. And what I see in this vote in the General Assembly is that there is the beginnings of a new non-aligned movement. There is a huge number of countries that have either abstained or absented themselves. How will the U.S. deal with the new and emerging non-aligned movement if it were to come to fruition? Thank you.
You know, so on the first question, I was never somebody who said that Middle East energy doesn't matter anymore. So nothing's really changed for me. I still think that if the U.S. cares about its global role, which I think most Americans do, energy is a globally treated commodity. And the rise in energy prices anywhere means the rise in energy prices everywhere, that all of our Asian allies get most of their energy from the Middle East. And so getting out of the Middle East to go to Asia doesn't get you out of the Middle East, it gets you into the Middle East from the other side. So I never accepted the argument that we could abandon the Middle East. I think people say we're not really abandoning it. I do think there's been a renewed understanding that we do need to have a thoughtful strategy toward the area, and there does need to be something affirmative and positive in addition to the negative. From the conversations I've had with the administration, the openness to that idea is certainly greater now than it was 2 or 3 months ago. exactly where it'll come out, what the elements will be. Again, I think there's a desire to have a positive role to play on the genuine strategic issues of the region, which, as I say, I mean, I don't know anybody looking at this in a think tank, and I'm really serious about looking at it. I think the energy transition is the most profound thing to hit the Middle East that's on the agenda. And nobody's thinking through what it looks like. Nobody's thinking through what the economic and political and social implications of it will be in terms of employment. And if you can't build a robust private sector, you know, are you going to have massive emigration? Are you going to have internal conflict? I mean, there are real challenges for the region. And that's something the region is going to have to work out. And I believe that there will be both more volatility within the region and more differentiation in how successful different governments are in dealing with that challenge. That's one thing. In terms of a new non-aligned movement, I don't know. You know, I looked at that vote. It was 140 to 5 with about 40 abstentions. I'm sure glad I'm not part of that 5, because that was not really a great 5 to be a member of. You know, I noted that apparently the Israelis persuaded the UAE that they should stop hedging quite as much, which is interesting. I'm not sure, you know, what Russia's doing just doesn't seem to me to be one of those things that's value neutral. And I'm not saying this because I'm an American, although as you've noticed, I am an American. But that's not why I'm saying it. It seems that rolling into another country and saying, we just don't like where you're going, is not what countries should do. It's just not what countries should do. It's not that Ukraine was in violation of international law. It's not that Ukraine threatened Russia. Ukraine had an orientation that Russia didn't really like. And Russia's never accepted that Ukraine should be a separate country anyway. And it seems to me that in the world of international affairs, that's not a value neutral set of actions. And so, you know, non-aligned, I'm not, I think, let me just broaden it. You know, one of the things I'm looking at in this trip is what people think the China model is and how relevant it is to different countries in the region. And frankly, the United States doesn't have a problem with countries with economic engagement with China. There's a natural, U.S. has, China's our #1 trading partner. Right? China is a source, is a destination for a huge amount of American LNG. That's not the issue. But there are security issues. There are issues of international law and whether countries can just roll across the border and destroy other countries because that's what their mood or orientation is. I don't think that's about alignment. I think that's about, are there any standards at all? And I think the standards should be upheld. And I think if we're going to complain, as we should, about countries doing that, we should apply it broadly, but we should apply it. And to start picking and choosing because you like what the outcome is, I think undermines your ability to make the broader case.
Well, John, I agree with you. I don't think that non-alignment is going to be born quickly. And I also agree with you, and I said this publicly here, that Putin is wrong to have used force in Ukraine. But as Lavrov said the other day, they learned that from you. You did exactly the same thing in Iraq. You supported it in other places. So, again,
Exactly the same thing in Iraq?
what was the logic of going to Iraq? What was the justification?
No.
Into Iraq, not Kuwait. Iraq. We fought with you in Kuwait, and we've spoken out. We voted against the Russians on Ukraine. So we're being consistent in that respect. But frankly, you're not. But that's again. That's
No, I think the administration genuinely believed the incorrect intelligence about Iraq. I think they genuinely believed it. And I think it was tied to 9/11.
use force unilaterally, nevertheless. So you took it upon yourself to use force when you decided you had to use it. That's what Putin did. I do not support what Putin did. All I'm just trying to say here is that if Putin had not gone beyond the two republics that he recognized, that vote, if you had tried to put a vote against the Russians there, it would have been back-offs. The West would not have gotten the support. They got the support because he used military force on the ground. Anyway, let me move to the back on the right here.
Hi, John. My name is Muhammad Nusser. I work at the private sector. And I have a few questions with regard to your 30 years experience in the region, if you allow me. Do you think the United States is more popular now in the region or less popular? Do you think that people trust the United States or distrust? Do you think the United States has the capacity of fixing the problem around or not? Other question is, we always talk about conflict in the Middle East between Shia and Sunni, between Fatah and Hamas. Do you see the United States has its own mistakes, fundamental mistakes? And then my last two questions, how you compare between Biden democracy and Bush democracy, agenda promotion, and Egypt and United States relationship? So choose whatever you would like to answer.
Yeah. So as I say, I think that skepticism of the United States has been one of the great constants in the Middle East for the last 30 years. I don't remember many times when there was much enthusiasm for U.S. foreign policy. I've heard different explanations for it, but it seems to always give the same result. There are certainly times when different American leaders have been more popular with leaders in the region. And I think that the Trump administration was an interesting example of when public support for the United States diminished in a place like Egypt, but the president of Egypt had a very close relationship with President Trump. Look, I mean, of course the United States has made all kinds of mistakes in the region, and the region's made all kinds of mistakes. I still think that there is something the U.S. has to contribute, and I think something we could build together that would be durable and resilient. I think the U.S. does care in a profound strategic way about what the Middle East looks like in 20 or 30 years, and has an interest in that, and has interest in playing a role. One of the things the U.S. has done is frankly supporting the American University in Cairo, which has been a long-term American investment, started as a missionary exercise, but I think over the decades, with money from American schools and hospitals abroad, the American taxpayer, U.S. government helped build the AUC campus in Taqum al-Khamis. I think that has played a really constructive role for Egypt, for creating a cadre of talented Egyptians who can contribute to governance in Egypt, to the economic growth of the country. I think we can find lots of examples of really constructive things the U.S. has done. I mean, defeating bilharzia, right? Maternal and child health, population growth. I mean, the U.S. has been really involved in a lot of very positive things in Egypt. I would like the U.S. to stay involved in doing those things. Again, I think that the coercive nature doesn't work, and I think the coercive nature is not in the appetite of the administration. I think, and this is a topic for a totally different discussion, but my friend Adel Adoui, professor at AUC, and I were on a debate, what was it, 6 months ago? 9 months ago? And I think the aid relationship that we've had has actually become an irritant rather than a lubricant in our relationship. But I'd like to find more ways to build a really constructive relationship, which is a partnership that Egyptians feel vested in and feels is helping them get to where the country wants to be, and there's a U.S. role helping that happen. I think that would be in both of our interests.
Thank you, John. Very nice to see you, and thank you very much for your nice talk. There are two or three ideas I wish to comment on. Number one is the aims, the goals, and the way the United States foreign policy is being conducted. Recently, the whole world was mobilized, getting ready for a Cold War between the United States and China. Suddenly, it became United States and Russia. So the idea of non-alignment has to be revisited. What do we mean by non-alignment? Vis-a-vis China, America, or between China and America, or between Russia and America, and under what circumstances? And of course, you know that the discussion about non-alignment policy, a new non-alignment policy, was there in so many think tanks around the world, but in different terms, a non-alignment model 21st century. The mobilization by the United States of the whole world getting pivot Asia, not only America, but all of us should turn our attention to the events that, the coming events in Asia. Now it is Europe. The way the United States dealt with all those problems with China, with Russia, and in mobilizing countries raised question marks about the credibility of your policy. The most recent one is the contacts with Maduro of Venezuela. After pressuring and mobilizing all Latin American countries, don't talk to him, don't sell him anything, don't buy anything from him. Suddenly, US wants or plans to buy oil from Venezuela. And perhaps several countries in Latin America read about those news, as we did in the newspapers, that America had a phone call yesterday between somebody here and somebody there, America, Venezuela. As we in the region suffered from many problems pertaining to the way the United States is conducting its policy in the region. I'm not going to raise the Palestinian question now, but the Iraqi question. You went to Iraq with goals about democratization, etc., and then left it to Iran. A question mark about that. That raised a lot of questions about the credibility of a foreign policy, especially of the superpower. That is one thing. The other thing is about America. America won its prestigious superpower place mainly based on, or primarily based on, the soft policy. Harvard, NASA, Hollywood, you name it, things that attracted the attention of so many generations. Despite the fact that we, because we were younger also, brought up with America, the films of America, the cars coming from America, the universities that we had of, the schools in America, and so on. So this kind of soft power will not be affected. What will be affected, and is already done, is the image of the United States as a powerful country, but using its force and its foreign policy for goals that misunderstood. Many of us don't understand why. Why is this, for example, 99% bias to Israel? Why they going to Iran on the assumption that to Iraq, I'm sorry, on the assumption that Iraq has a nuclear power facilities, etc., which was not true, and all of us knew that, including the US. Those question marks that raised questions about the credibility of a foreign policy of the superpower has harmed America a lot. The question is, okay, now that the issue of Ukraine has a priority on the list of problems, the question is, what happened exactly? Was Putin just thinking of something, and Ukraine, Georgia, etc., should be part of its vital neighborhood, or Ukraine was pushed to provoke Putin, by this NATO, the request to join NATO or to join and the European Union, and that you just do that and we'll be behind you, we shall defend you, to end up by what we see as destructive, the destruction that happened to, is happening to, by this invasion, which we all reject definitely because of the sovereignty of countries, and we who made war against Saddam because he invaded Kuwait, or any other invasion, are also opposed to the American decision to invade Iraq back in 2003, cannot change our position and say this invasion is good and this invasion is bad, like the many examples in history. So there is a problem of credibility. And we hope that things would not turn out to be a total big Cold War with 3 parties in it, and for the rest of the world paying the price for that.
Thank you. So let me sort of take a few key points there. First, I don't think the U.S. was ever trying to create a Cold War with China in terms of preventing China from engaging in the Middle East. I mean, China's been engaging in the Middle East. There's been a concern about Chinese technology creating security vulnerabilities, which is not a totally unreasonable thing to worry about. There's concern about China using its relationships to create surveillance against American force projection in the Middle East. But I'm convinced for a number of things. First, I don't think China wants to displace the United States in the Middle East. I don't think China wants a rivalry with the United States in the Middle East. And I don't think the US was trying to create a Cold War with China. I don't think that's what was going on. And I think you see China has comprehensive strategic partnerships with Saudi Arabia, with the Emirates, with Egypt, with some of America's greatest partners in the Middle East. So I just don't think there was a Cold War. You know, on the Iraq War, I always thought the Iraq War was a mistake. I think in retrospect, it is viewed by most people in the United States as the most strategic blunder the U.S. has made in the 20th century, and one of the largest strategic blunders the U.S. has made in its modern history. So we agree on that. I mean, it was a mistake, but again, I think you have to see it in the context of the disorientation that followed 9/11, the fact that intelligence is never as good as you wish it were. You can say we all knew, but we didn't all know, and the United States had been attacked in the continental United States for the first time since the War of 1812, and people had no idea what would happen, what the world would be like. I think it's easy. It's easy to look now and say, well, none of those things were going to happen. They didn't happen. They never were going to happen. And that's a lot easier to tell in retrospect than it was at the time. So I agree. I had deep misgivings about the war in Iraq, not least because, and I've told people then and I told people since, everybody who's written a book on Iraq in English could sit around my dining room table and I know all of them, and that's not a good way to go into a country where you think you're going to set up what the government's going to look like. Because I know all of them, they can all fit around my dining room table, and I don't have a very big dining room table, right? We didn't know what we were doing. There was tremendous arrogance. Remember, we had we were getting rid of the dirty dozen, and then Iraq was going to be a democracy. I said, based on what? Right? But that was the either. And the U.S. government made a profound mistake. The Bush administration made a profound mistake. I can't imagine in a million years the Bush administration would have gone to Iraq without 9/11. And I can't imagine in a million years a future administration is going to want to go into the Middle East to take down an authoritarian government and establish a democracy. I think we've gotten that out of our system. It is a tragedy at best, and perhaps worse, for what the U.S. did in Iraq and the instability it created and the openings created for Iran and all those other things. Totally agree. So we agree on that. On the Ukraine, I don't think the U.S. was trying to create a conflict with Ukraine. The U.S. wasn't trying to, nobody was trying to extend NATO membership to the Ukraine. The Ukraine effort to join the EU came after the invasion and not before. I think there was always a sense of there's some constructive ambiguity with Ukraine because you don't want to antagonize Russia, but you also don't want to deny Ukrainians' ability to decide their own future. And so U.S. policy was to do those things to both not antagonize Russia and protect the sovereignty of Ukrainians. And that wasn't good enough for Putin, who had other designs. But I don't think that this was a war the U.S. sought or instigated or tried to use to its advantage. I think the problem is you have a leader in Russia who is willing to roll the dice, who believes that people respect force, who wants to reestablish the glory of the Soviet Union under a Russian guise, or maybe the glory of the Russian Empire under a Russian guise, who doesn't recognize the right of Ukrainians to decide their future. And I think you have the United States, among others, saying we can't have an international system where might makes right. There has to be some semblance of international law. There has to be a respect for the rights of the governed. And we have to stop it in the Ukraine lest it spread to other countries in Eastern Europe. Where that will leave us all, I don't know. A lot of it depends on what Putin does and how much he wants to push this war. I look at what Putin's done in Syria, and I think that the Russian indifference to civilian suffering is deeply troubling. And I don't know how long this is going to last, and I don't know how many people are going to die in the interim. But it seems to me that international solidarity will help us get to the end of this sooner rather than later. Hopefully will lead to less civilian suffering rather than more. And so we can reach some accommodation where people respect borders and the sovereignty of people to decide their own future.
Thank you, John. The last two questions, because we want to remain on time. But people recommend, and I'm very happy.
Thank you, Dean Fahmy, and thank you, Dean Fahmy, and thank you, John, and welcome to Cairo. I would like to take
Mohammed
you
is an
back.
old friend from my AUC days a long time ago.
Right.
We both used to have more hair. It used to be darker.
Thanks. I would like to take you back to American domestic politics. You talked about the revolt against the elite, the East Coast elite or the establishment elite. I agree with you on that point, but I would also argue that a new elite is being formed within the Democratic Party and within the Republican Party. The Democratic Party, the so-called the progressive wing of the party, and I can totally understand where they come from. Okay, I know their intellectual terms of reference. They're still liberals, and they call themselves liberals. But I have actually a big problem. I hope you can help me understand. The new elite on the Republican side, the people that Trump will support in the primaries and the midterm elections, what is their intellectual terms of reference? You know, what are their views? And my bigger question is about the conservative movement in the U.S., you know, with people like Liz Cheney disappearing and so on. So what's left of the conservative movement and the conservative idea? And what's the future of the conservative idea in the U.S.? Thanks.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Lukas Behrenbeck. I'm an advisor to the German government on UN affairs, and thank you for this enriching talk. I've been wondering, we've been talking again also about things that are happening in the region, in countries of the Middle East, but it's also interesting to talk about the Middle Eastern countries as an actor themselves, and it's very interesting to me how Turkey and Israel have been offering themselves as mediators between Ukraine and Russia. We've also seen during the Trump years how other countries stepped in, like Qatar, for example, in the Afghanistan issue. Egypt again had a prominent role in negotiating a ceasefire between Israel and Hamas last year, and Egypt is going to host the COP this year. So I wonder which place Egypt could fill in future finding solutions to new international challenges, and how it could work with America on good ideas, as you said, finding such solutions, and also which role the Egyptian public could play in that, in being behind a strong Egyptian role on the international stage and engaging them. And finally also maybe about the disagreements that still exist between the US and Egypt on also values and democratic ideas. If this is going to be a stumbling block in helping Egypt become a more prominent actor, because I guess Egypt is such a strong, big country with also history and international, finding international solutions to global challenges. And I think they could become an even stronger role in the future again. So I would like to have your thoughts on this. Thank you.
Thank you. Mohammed, frankly, I don't think there's a real intellectual ground. It's a populist movement, which is, you know, the nature of populism is to say that all of us are actually the same except for the small minority, and we have to rally against the minority. I think that's what it really is. I think it's a deep sense of alienation in a large part of the country. But I think, you know, what you saw in the Trump administration was frankly a president who didn't have a sustained intellectual frame of reference. A lot of it was personalized with his relationship with individual leaders. And I don't think this movement has a strong intellectual basis. I think it's interesting the way it sort of fractures along the lines of what do you do about Russia? You know, is Putin brilliant or is Putin a thug? And it's actually creating a very interesting debate in the Republican Party. I don't know, I don't think the Republican Party knows where it comes out of the Trump years. I mean, there certainly is going to be a battle for the heart and soul of the party in the next presidential election. I don't think anybody is comfortable predicting how that's going to come out. I don't think anybody knows whether Trump is going to run and, you know, what kind of traction he'll have. So I think, you know, we'll have to see where we are in 2025 with what happened with the election and whether it represented the consolidation of control of this part of the movement, or whether it's split, whether splitting it keeps the party from getting control of Congress. I don't know, but it feels to me like, again, we're in the middle of a broader societal redefinition, which I really do think, I mean, I grew up in the 1960s and 70s. Those were the disorienting moments I had as a child. We're trying to figure out what was going around me. I grew up in Poughkeepsie, New York, which was a college town with Vassar College. My mother thought that Vassar girls would be the best babysitters, so I spent a lot of time on the Vassar campus, and there was a lot I really didn't understand. And I think we are in a similar kind of moment with all kinds of things that are being redefined in American life. And again, I think this is going to take us beyond 2025 to figure out where we're going to land, but I do think there are going to be a lot of transformational aspects. You know, on the question of what Egypt can do, it's interesting you mentioned COP, because I think that there are ways in which Egypt on the energy side may actually have a really interesting role to play in the region, not just with Ben, not just with wind. Somebody in the Egyptian embassy in Washington was talking to me about electric car assembly. Egypt could play a transformative role in a global energy transition as a large country with a large workforce, with lots of sun and lots of wind and lots of empty space. You know, you could begin to imagine that Egypt really could play a role both in an Arab context and in a global context, especially as the world is trying to find ways to get off an addiction to Russian gas. Now, the world is going to need Russian gas for a long time to come. And there's not a sort of 2-year fix to that. But I think the longer term growth that Egypt can play, and COP is a way that Egypt can both highlight and accelerate its movement. I think there are ways that Egypt can, in partnership with the United States and other countries, play a really important leadership role. I assume that people are talking about doing that. I think a lot of countries, including China, look to Egypt and say, Egypt is pivotal. And to me, one of the mysteries of the last decade has been Egypt's sustained marginalization from both global affairs and regional affairs. I remember 20 years ago, people kept talking about Egypt as a pivotal state. And I haven't heard people talking about Egypt as a pivotal state for more than a decade. But I could imagine that energy and other things could lead Egypt to be considered a pivotal state once again. And frankly, as somebody, you know, who's been coming to Egypt between 1991 and 2016, I came to Egypt at least once a year, every single year. As somebody with a deep commitment to Egypt, a deep affection for Egypt, deep admiration of what Egypt can do, I have to tell you that Egypt's rising centrality in the world, in that very constructive, innovative, forward-leaning way, is something that not only I would find personally gratifying, but I think would be great for Egypt, and I think would be great for the world.
Now, really, the last two questions right here, and we'll take them together.
I am Ahmed Al-Bouhi. Okay, I am Master of Global Affairs from AUC. I am now a PhD candidate at Cairo University. There is a major dilemma in foreign policy. On one hand, there is a view that that is expressed here by two former foreign ministers of Egypt, that the U.S. foreign policy decision-making is inconsistent, confused, based on reaction rather than action, due to the continuous changing of administration and so on. Not only because the continuous change of administration, there is also the example mentioned by Minister Amr that the changing of stance towards Venezuela, for example. On the other hand, there is the other view that there is a subtle continuity in American foreign policy decision making. People who think that America deliberately plan for policy, and there is a deep state. Trump can call it a deep state or something, and it's not unfounded on weak evidence. There was in the first years of Trump, I remember an article in Foreign Affairs under a hidden author or under a hidden authorship, who claims that he is a senior member of Trump's administration, and he claimed that there are people in the administration holding different positions who are trying to halt his more eccentric tendencies towards foreign policy, who are trying to stop his extremes.
It was in the New York Times, and he was subsequently revealed, so.
Okay, don't worry.
No, I mean,
there was rumors that he was, I think, Pompeo or something.
It was not, no.
No.
But the story is all well known, and it's a less interesting story.
So, which opinion is the right opinion? Thank you.
It's a very, very simple question. I'm just more wondering about, it has been 12 days for the Ukraine war. And actually, my question here, what will happen within the coming few days? I mean, specifically, because it's still a proper for the war. We don't have a war yet. And what will happen, what's the United States role for this war specifically? Yeah, that's what I mean.
Okay. Yeah, let me answer your question this way. The U.S. government, in order to deal with the complexity of problems that it has, I mean, you say the U.S. has been inconsistent. The U.S. has a system that tries to deal with profoundly huge amounts of information and profoundly vast number of decisions it has to make by having a process. And the process starts in bureaucracies, and it works its way up to the National Security Council, which sorts things out, and then you have National Security Council meetings, and it goes to the president making decisions. There's a lot of information that gets funneled into the system. It is considered, and you consider alternate points of view and scenario building and all those kinds of things. And President Trump didn't like processes and didn't like receiving information. He liked talking to people on the phone who were his friends and going with his gut. And there were people in the government who said, that's not why you have a multi-billion-dollar intelligence operation. That's not why you have 15,000 foreign service officers around the world. And the president shouldn't just be making random decisions, including cutting off aid to the Ukraine because of some personal desire that he had. Right? And I think that conflict is legitimate conflict. There are laws. One of the laws the president broke is he destroyed documents that were government documents. The president is a public servant, not a business person. And there are rules that require the president to be a public servant. And President Trump never really accepted that understanding. He thought his job was to be a leader, and that his experience was in a very small private company, which he owned, which he could do whatever he wanted to do. And the nature of the US government is everybody has to follow processes and rules, because that's the only way you can deal with the complexity and the amount of information of the job. I don't think that means there's a deep state. I mean, I think it means that there are rules, and we don't have a king. We have a president who is in office for a limited period of time to serve the interests of the American people. And serve is the word. You're not to profit from it. It's not about control. It's to serve the interests of the American people. And I think that's what the job of the president is, and I think it's appropriate that the president be held to account. What's going to happen in Ukraine? I don't know, but I look at what Russia's done in Syria, and I see I don't see a huge Russian commitment to using ground forces to seize territory, to control, and then to build a government. I see a pattern of Russian action to pound areas into submission. And I'm afraid that over the next several days, we're going to see more Russian efforts to use force from distance to try to weaken the Ukrainian resistance. I think we're starting to see efforts to shut down the supply chains in the west of the country. But I think that the principal thrust, and some of my colleagues had a monkey cage article in the Washington Post on Friday, which argued that look at how Russia's operated in Syria for an example of how Russia is likely to operate in the Ukraine, and that is with profound indifference to civilian lives.
John, thank you very much. Thank you. As always, you've been straightforward in your answers and very insightful. I hope the rest of your trip, you gain as much from us as we have gained from you in this hour. And I want to also thank everybody here for coming. You're always welcome at the American University in Cairo, and particularly at the Tahrir Dialogues. Thank you and good night.